relives. That's how many people she healed, before the same community turned on her and marched her toward the fire. Buried deep in the coastal plantations of South Carolina is the story of an enslaved woman whose gift seemed almost impossible to explain. Fevers broke after her touch. Infections eased. Families whispered her name with a mix of awe and fear, until admiration turned into suspicion. By the summer of 1748, after a string of miraculous recoveries, the same households that had begged for her help now accused her of practicing forbidden arts. Then came the morning of August 14th, when the guards from the Georgetown District Jail opened the iron door to escort her to her execution. But the cell was empty. No shattered locks. No torn bricks. No tunnel. No helpers caught in the act. Just absence, cold, absolute, and impossible. The woman who was supposed to burn had simply vanished. Magistrates ordered the incident erased from official records. And for nearly 3 centuries, her story stayed sealed away in private journals and church archives, until fragments of the truth survived. Tonight, we're going to follow those fragments back through time, because what happened next didn't just terrify one community. It terrified an entire system that depended on controlling who was allowed to know. But first, step back to the beginning. A plantation built on knowledge and fear. In 1731, the settlement that would become Georgetown sat along the Waccamaw Bay, surrounded by rivers that shaped the natural harbor of the Atlantic. The region was hot, humid, and brutal, where money and mosquitoes were both relentless. One of the biggest plantations in the area was Fairmont, covering nearly 800 acres of prime tidal land. Rice fields stretched inland for miles, engineered into geometric patterns. The main house stood tall, built with cypress wood and tabby walls, designed to catch every breeze. And behind those walls was an entire world built on enslavement, where the people most essential to survival were still treated as property. Jonathan Fairmont inherited the plantation young and wealthy, educated, ambitious, and anxious about status. His wife Catherine was even younger, and her health was fragile. Her cough worsened with time, and local doctors dismissed it as weakness of constitution. In that household, the enslaved community lived in cabins behind the main house, close enough to be summoned quickly, but far enough to keep propriety intact. Sarah arrives. Sarah arrived in early spring of 1731, sold from a plantation in Virginia after her previous owner died. The bill of sale described her as healthy and useful for domestic work, but it didn't mention the leather pouch around her neck, or the knowledge she carried, knowledge that couldn't be inventoried like a tool. She was observant, careful with her hands. And people didn't just notice her skill, they noticed how uncomfortable it made them to see someone paying too much attention to what others ignored. At first, she kept quiet, learning the rhythms of the plantation and the personalities that controlled it. But then, one worker, Thomas, cut his hand repairing a gate. The wound worsened quickly in the heat. The overseer wrote it down and did nothing. A doctor's time was expensive. Thomas showed the wound to Sarah one evening. And she didn't speak much. She examined it, then disappeared into the woods beyond the quarters. When she returned, she brought what looked like ordinary plants to everyone else, but her method was different. She crushed the right leaves, mixed them with clean water, and bound the paste to his wound. Within 3 days, the blackness retreated. Within 2 weeks, Thomas could grip an axe without pain. Soon, other people came to her with their illnesses, fevers, coughs, swelling joints, infections that weren't healing. She treated them at night, usually in silence. She never asked for payment. But people left small gifts anyway, rice saved from rations, scraps of cloth, carved wooden spoons. The main house notices. Eventually, what happened in the quarters began reaching the plantation center. In July, the overseer McCleasick became violently ill. He couldn't leave his small house near the mill. He arrived for 2 days while someone sent for the doctor. But the doctor was busy elsewhere. Time was running out. Sarah was brought in. She examined McCleasick and concluded the symptoms matched something he'd eaten combined with brackish well water from the rice fields. She prepared a tea from specific bark and roots, then gave it in measured doses. 4 days later, McLeesick was back on his horse, shouting orders again. Even Jonathan Fairmont noted it in his ledger. Soon after, Catherine's cough worsened. The Georgetown physician, Dr. Hayes, prescribed bleeding and purging, then a costly tonic that did nothing. Catherine grew thinner, her breathing worse, and blood-filled handkerchiefs became part of the household routine. At that point, Catherine's life depended on a decision everyone had been quietly avoiding, whether to allow the enslaved healer to treat her. Sarah insisted Catherine needed something more than purges. She needed air. Windows open. A change in routine, outside time, river air, carefully prepared remedies. Hayes called it dangerous superstition. But Catherine was already failing, and Jonathan, desperate, let Sarah continue. 3 weeks later, Catherine walked downstairs to dinner. 4 weeks later, her cough eased to occasional clearing. 6 weeks later, she asked for her sewing basket, proof she had regained strength. The story spread fast. Other plantation families began sending for Sarah too, always with permissions negotiated between owners. And yet, the enslaved community understood something everyone else pretended not to: being valuable could also be a threat. Because when enslaved people became too competent, when they made educated white men look ineffective, that didn't fit the social order. So Sarah kept careful records of the people she treated, survival marks on wood, including whether each patient was enslaved or free. By spring of 1748, she had treated 33 people successfully. Then came the 34th. Benjamin's death. Benjamin Fairmont, Jonathan's only son, was born in 1743. When Catherine raised him, everyone assumed she would stay childless no longer, and Benjamin became the future of the plantation. In April of 1748, at 5 years old, Benjamin developed a fever. Sarah examined him. She prepared remedies designed to reduce the fever and keep the illness from settling into his lungs. She coached others on precise timing and care. But Jonathan was panicked, and he summoned Dr. Hayes. Hayes arrived, assessed Benjamin, and prescribed bleeding, the kind of treatment that made sense only if you believed the body was something to drain, not support. Sarah confronted Jonathan directly. She warned that bleeding would weaken the boy. She begged him to continue what she had started. Hayes overheard the argument and escalated it into something bigger than medicine. He insisted Jonathan had to choose Sarah's plant superstitions or trained medical authority. Jonathan chose Hayes. And for the first time, Sarah was forbidden from entering the main house. Over the next days, Benjamin was bled repeatedly. His fever spiked. A rash appeared. Hayes interpreted it as proof the bad humors were being expelled. Then Benjamin couldn't keep down water. On the 5th day, Benjamin died. Catherine screamed. Jonathan drank. And Dr. Hayes collected his fee, leaving behind grief sharpened into rage. In the slave quarters, Sarah wept for a child she couldn't save, because she wasn't allowed to try. How mercy becomes witchcraft. Then the accusation began. At a dinner at the Thornton plantation, Hayes casually mentioned how Sarah's remedies seemed to work too well to be natural. He implied there must be something hidden, something dark. Soon whispers became certainty, and fear hardened into a plan. What if her cures weren't medicine at all? What if she was poisoning people slowly, until the timing was just right? What if Catherine had only improved temporarily to lull everyone into trust, before collecting the cost? Religious doubt turned into social panic. And in a society where enslaved people were barred from education, knowledge itself became evidence of crime. So on May 3, 1748, Jonathan filed a complaint accusing Sarah of practicing witchcraft, using diabolical arts to harm and kill. South Carolina didn't even have witchcraft statutes, but that didn't stop the investigation. The magistrate, convinced by fear and resentment, moved forward anyway. Sarah was arrested on May 5th. They searched her cabin. They removed the leather pouch from her neck. Inside were dried plants, small roots, a piece of quartz, and a handwritten notebook filled with plant drawings and notes. They claimed it proved occult knowledge. She was brought to Georgetown jail, shackled, unnecessarily cruelly treated, even though she offered no resistance. Trial without justice. The trial lasted 2 days in late May. Hayes testified that her methods violated natural law. Other witnesses described her as uncanny, claims that sounded harmless alone but turned into a portrait of someone beyond human ability. Sarah wasn't allowed to testify in her own defense. But the magistrate eventually offered her a question. When she spoke, she didn't claim magic. She explained her learning, passed down through her mother and her mother before that. She said every plant has properties. Every illness has patterns. She claimed she only watched and cared, not enchanted. When asked how she predicted outcomes for others, she answered bluntly. Doctors were bleeding people when they needed fluids. They were closing windows when patients needed air. They treated theories instead of watching what was real. The verdict came quickly. Sarah was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to die by burning, executed at dawn on June 1st. The locked cell that couldn't be beaten. By that point, the community had already decided what the truth had to be. If the jail door opened, it had to be fate or supernatural power. But then something happened that made the story even stranger. Sarah's jailkeeper was Hosea Jenkins. He was not known for cruelty, just for doing his job. He brought her food. He rarely spoke. He kept watch. And then, the night before the execution, May 31st, something unsettled him. Sarah told Jenkins a detail about his 11-year-old daughter Martha. The headaches were treatable, but only if given the right remedy at the right moment. Jenkins didn't want to believe her. But when he tried her advice, Martha's pain eased within an hour, and by afternoon, she was back up and playing. That night, Jenkins made his decision. He unlocked her cell while pretending to review ledgers in another room. Then he gave her supplies and directions. Go north, away from plantations and away from people who would hunt her for being too knowledgeable. Sarah didn't vanish through magic. She walked out. At midnight on June 1st, she left the jail. At dawn, at about 5:47 a.m., Jenkins came to escort her to the stake. And the cell was empty. No broken locks. The door had been opened with a key. The window remained secure. No tunnel. No escape route carved into brick. The impossible became the only explanation everyone was willing to accept: witchcraft. The search and the consequences. Search parties went into the woods. Bounty hunters came from Charleston. 2 weeks passed with no proof she'd escaped by ordinary means. Meanwhile, at Fairmont, misfortune began circling the plantation like a shadow. The rice harvest failed in one section. Barn fires destroyed seed stock. Tools broke, fences collapsed, horses fell lame. Nothing could be proven, but it all looked like retaliation. Not loud rebellion. Not violence. Just a deliberate refusal to thrive on a system that had tried to destroy someone more skilled than its owners wanted to admit. Dr. Hayes published an account of Sarah's escape and witchcraft. But educated readers mocked it. Some even suggested his medical practice was the real danger. And over time, Sarah's case did something strange. It pushed witchcraft accusations to decline, because people began realizing the practical problems with such prosecutions. If accused witches could escape in impossible ways, then what were the trials for? And if human help could enable escape, then the social consensus wasn't as solid as it pretended. The confession after decades. Her real ending wasn't known for almost 30 years. It surfaced in 1779 when Hosea Jenkins, dying of fever, made a deathbed confession. He told his pastor she wasn't taken away by magic. He unlocked the door. He pretended not to notice. She walked out. But Jenkins revealed even more. A free black woman named Phyllis Rutherford had been visiting Sarah, through scripture readings offered as proper charity. But within those readings, she embedded information, escape routes, safe houses, names, warnings. Sarah wasn't just saved by one man's conscience. She was supported by a network that understood when law stopped protecting people and started protecting power. Sarah becomes Rachel in the back country. After escaping, Sarah reportedly traveled through Cherokee trading paths. Over time, she became known as Rachel, sometimes said to have worked among Cherokee communities and settlers, treating everyone who came to her with respect. Oral histories later described her as a tall healer with careful hands, observant eyes, and a kind of competence that didn't require permission. For years, from roughly 1748 to the early 1750s, she lived among the Cherokee, trading knowledge and learning techniques that her hosts respected. She later reportedly married a mixed-race trader named William Crawford, and after his death, she continued as an independent practitioner. She kept writing, documenting remedies, seasonal changes, patterns, and patient observations. Her literacy, her record-keeping, her willingness to learn, were exactly the things enslavers tried to erase. When she died in 1764, her death was wrapped in the kind of communal care that official history rarely records. A large gathering across races, where people wept together at her grave. Legacy, not just escape, impact. Sarah's story survived in records and in memory. Centuries later, historians would piece together fragments that pointed to one undeniable truth. She wasn't a witch. She was a healer, whose knowledge threatened a system that demanded ignorance. And her legacy wasn't just surviving the stake. It was the lives she saved, the people she trained, and the example of mercy, sometimes chosen quietly, over law. Because in the end, the question isn't only what happened to Sarah. It's what it means that her world tried to call competence evil, and what it says about the community that still chose to help her anyway.